Hello and welcome to episode number 314. This is the Project Management Podcast at pm-podcast.com, and I'm Cornelius Fichtner. Welcome back. Incomplete or missed requirements, omissions, ambiguous product features, lack of user involvement, unrealistic customer expectations, and the proverbial scope creep can result in cost overruns, missed deadlines, poor product quality, and can very well ruin a project. That is why Jamal Mustafayev wrote his new book about the topic of project scope management. It is a practical guide to requirements for pretty much any industry, and it describes how to elicit, document, and manage requirements to control project scope creep. It also explains how to manage project stakeholders to minimize the risk of an ever-growing list of user requirements. This episode of the Project Management Podcast is sponsored by the PM Exam Simulator. If you're preparing for the PMP exam, then the best way to calm the butterflies in your stomach is to take a practice exam. Our PMP Exam Simulator offers you 9 such practice exams. To see how it works, take a free test drive and go to freeexamsimulator.com. But now back to scope management. Scope is important because every single one of our projects is launched to deliver something, and that something is defined in our scope. So Jamal and I not only look at what the state of scope management overall is and how business analysis plays into this, but we end our interview, of course, with scope management tips and tricks for you. Enjoy the interview.
Project Management Podcasts Feature Interview.
Today with Jamal Mustafayev, President and CEO of Think Tank Consulting, a consulting company specializing in project and portfolio management services.
Hello, Jamal. Welcome to the Project Management Podcast.
Hello, Cornelius. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well, thank you. And you must be doing well also, considering that your new book is out.
Yes, quite happy about that. Quite happy. It just came out about a month ago, so yeah, I was looking forward to chatting with you.
Yeah. So the book is titled Project Scope Management, a practical guide to requirements for engineering, product, construction, IT, and enterprise products. That pretty much covers everything, doesn't it?
Well, yeah, that's what I was aiming at. As we will talk through this interview, hopefully I will give you more ideas about why I decided to write this book and, the domain that I was trying to cover.
Yeah, well, let's talk about the domain. What is project scope management?
Well, it's probably a good point to kind of start this conversation with somewhat of an exact definition so that, people have an understanding of what we're talking about. One of the definitions of project scope management that I like is that project scope management is setting the scope right at the very beginning of the project planning phase in order to define its outcomes and deliverables. And it is considered in project management to be a part of creating a vision for the team and stakeholders alike. And it includes 5 process groups called collect requirements, define scope, create work breakdown structure, verify scope, and control scope. So that's kind of in a nutshell a very short definition of what project scope management is.
Yeah, and what state is project scope management in nowadays?
You know what? I'm going to voice my personal opinion about that as someone who worked as a hands-on project manager for the first 15 years of my professional career. But that view has been supported by many of my colleagues around the world, especially in the last several years as I started traveling with my consulting engagements and my training engagements. It seems to be one of the most neglected domains in project management. Because if you even look up in PMBOK version 5, I'm not going to be quoting exactly what it says, but it states something to the effect of once the project manager gets the product scope definition from the technical experts, she can embark on the creation of the project work breakdown structure with the assistance of her team. Now, the main problem with that statement, in my opinion, is that what happens exactly from the point of time when Cornelius came to me and said, please build me a 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom Tuscan-style home, to the point of time when my architects and designers came up with an exact bill of materials and an exact blueprint, remains an enigma. How do I elicit all the requirements? How do I document them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? If I can use some industry statistics to support my point of view, as of the last couple of years, our success rate with projects has been 32%. If you're looking at challenge projects, seriously over budget and seriously late, 44%. If you look at the failed ones, 24%. So performance overall on projects has not been that great. If you dig deeper, you will discover that 5 out of 8 top reasons why projects fail are related to requirements. And they include incomplete requirements, lack of user involvement, unrealistic customer expectations, changing requirements and specifications, customers no longer needing the features provided. Again, based on my personal experience, having incomplete requirements as a result very frequently of lack of user involvement are probably one of the main issues that we have in the industry. So that's my kind of very brief overview of the state of the project scope management nowadays.
I'm quite surprised that you say that project scope management is neglected, because from my perspective, the scope is it. This is what we're going to build. And if I neglect scope management, I pretty much neglect what I'm going to build. So how can I know what I'm going to build if I don't manage the scope well?
Exactly. And I still encounter a lot of projects all over the world, starting with, well, let's start building something, and then as we go, we'll figure out exactly what we want.
Is this the reason why you decided to write a book?
Yes, that's the main reason. And again, I have to give you some background on me. You probably know that, but I'm not sure your listeners do. My first 15 years of my professional experience working as a hands-on project manager have been mainly in the IT and software development sectors. And project scope manager pretty much very well taken care of in those domains. Why? Because we have something called business analysis or systems analysis or requirements analysis. I'm sure you're familiar and your listeners are familiar with those terms. And we had and we have very good books written by very well-known authors describing how to elicit functional and non-functional requirements. But as my career went into consulting and into training, and I started encountering projects in the domains of, say, telecom, banking, construction, large government initiatives, I suddenly discovered that they do not have a set methodology for project scope management or requirements, elicitation, analysis, and documentation. Some of the questions I've encountered personally and questions that have been asked of me by attendees of my courses. Well, we're doing this large government initiative. How should we capture the requirements? What methodology should we use to capture those requirements? What methodology should we use to analyze and document them? If I've been hired as a project manager to build a large shopping mall, am I responsible for the construction of that shopping mall, or am I responsible for the overall success of that shopping mall, i.e., bringing the retail customers who will open their stores, etc., plus marketing, plus PR? If I'm working on an enterprise type project or multidisciplinary type project, should I be using engineering standards of capturing the requirements, the architectural standards of capturing the requirements? If it has an IT component to it, should I be using IT component? If we continue the theme of multidisciplinary projects or enterprise projects, and hopefully, later in the interview, I'll provide you with a couple of examples of that. Should each department involved write its own scope document, and then we will unite them into one? And what happens if there are interdependencies between them? Would we be able to catch them all? So this is just the tip of the iceberg of the questions that you encounter as soon as you start working on larger projects. Again, construction, non-software product development projects, government initiatives, be it delivery of some product or some service. So these are the questions that I have encountered, and I try to answer them in my book, in my second book.
Every book sort of has a specific twist on its topic. What's your twist? What makes it unique?
It's actually funny that you asked that, because as I was trying to pitch it, the idea of that book to CRC Press, the trick that I used, if it can be called a trick, I basically went onto Amazon, and I, by the way, invite your listeners to do the same thing. And I tried to type search strings like project scope management, requirements engineering, requirements, scope definition, project scope definition, product scope definition. And almost invariably, pretty much I would dare to say all of the results I got, this happened about a year ago, maybe the situation has changed, were from the domain of IT and software development, which told me that there is nothing in the field of architecture, design, engineering, non-software development, product development out there. So what I try to do in that book, I try to get the best practices from IT and software development, get the best practices from engineering, get the best practices from architectural, kind of systemize it, institutionalize it, and put it in front of the people. The things that are, in my opinion, are common to all of these fields, they have been united into single chapters. And in some cases where you have to talk about, well, really documenting of requirements, say on enterprise projects, is somewhat different from IT and software development projects. I have written a different chapter for each one of those cases. So in a nutshell, I think third point maybe that it is very practical. I don't talk about theories that sound very good on paper, but are very difficult to implement in real life. I continued my, probably the fourth point that I should mention, I continued my point where I take in some cases, they're historical case studies. In some cases, they're modern case studies like analysis of Burj Al Arab, Palm Jumeirah projects, and trying to reverse engineer, how the requirements elicitation, analysis, and documentation might have gone on them. They happen pretty much at the beginning of every chapter. So in a nutshell, that's what I think that makes the book unique.
Okay, so the subtitle is A Practical Guide to Requirements for Engineering, Product Construction, IT, and Enterprise Projects. So it covers these 5 areas. Our listeners are project managers. Is the book for them? Is it intended for the project manager? Is it intended for the business analyst? Is it intended for a technical team? And what will they get out of reading the book?
Absolutely. First and foremost, obviously, the target audience that I had in mind were the project managers and the program managers, i.e. the people who are responsible for taking on the projects, making sure there is a requirements document prepared, making sure that there is a project plan created based on those requirements document, and then monitoring and control of the project during its execution stage. Having said that, I sincerely hope that technical resources, and when I say the word technical, I mean it in the broadest sense possible, engineers, architects, product managers, marketing people, sales people, financial people, accounting people, HR people who are, let's put it this way, contributors to the overall scope of their projects, might be interested in reading it to understand the complexities involved, the tricks and the techniques. I also hope that IT and software development people might read this book, although there's a lot of book was written in that domain, in that what we call business analysis, because they might have a better appreciation of what kind of impact the IT and software development work that they're doing is having on the overall business. Because, one of the things I tend to say in the last 2 or 3 years, it is very difficult to find a pure IT project anymore. If you think about, an example of SAP implementation, is it just an IT project, or is it a project, is it an enterprise project that affects pretty much every department within the company? So keeping that in mind is also important. So that's probably the 3 target groups for whom the book is written.
Yeah, you mentioned practical. What makes the book practical?
Well, as you know, in any field, be it project management, be it engineering, be it biology, or any other domain, there are some things that are very good, very interesting, and they're very practical. It is something that you can read, learn, and then say, well, I'm going to try this on my new project. Unfortunately, there's some things that are, again, very interesting, they make sense when you read them, but implementing them in real life is sometimes very challenging because it's difficult, it's complicated, it requires a lot of resources. So I call it pure theory in my vocabulary. So what I try to do in this book, as by the way, in my previous one, is to strip the methodologies described there from purely theoretical ones and put forward stuff that is purely practical. Again, based on my personal experiences and based on the feedback of my colleagues from around the world.
Right. I see that many of your chapters end with a subchapter called What Can Be Done. So at the end of each chapter, you talk about, okay, this is the problem, this is the issue, and here's what you can do on your project.
Yes, at the end of every chapter, I have a summary, kind of summarizing what's going on. But if you were to ask me, what are the top 5 advice from Jamal to the people who are willing to implement those techniques? Learn techniques described in the book. Use them, definitely. Don't be afraid to ask a lot of questions. Definitely know what kind of questions to ask. And the book provides a lot of information about the types of questions you should be asking. Don't be afraid to combine different methodologies, because in methodologies that work in some industries would not work in others. By all means, write requirement specification documentation. Make an attempt to do that on every project, especially larger, more sophisticated ones. And probably the last piece of advice would be to conduct customer walkthroughs, technical inspections, and peer reviews of the documentation you have written. So again, tip of the iceberg kind of thing, but I mean, these are the top advice that I would give to project managers who are working on such projects.
Business analysis and scope management often mentioned in the same word. I know about business analysis in the IT and software development industries, but what about the other fields? Construction, product development, engineering. Is business analysis something that is done over there? I don't have personal experience.
My personal professional, so to speak, experiences from around the world in the last 3 to 5 years tell me no, there is a big gap there. I'm not saying, again, your listeners should understand my point of view. I'm not saying that designers or architects don't know how to design a building. I'm just saying that there is a gap between the point of time when a customer comes in and says, I would like, let's go back to that very simplistic example of a 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom Tuscan style home. Between the point of time when a customer walks into the office and says, hey, I want you to build me a 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom Tuscan style home, and the point of time when designers can develop their blueprints, 3D images of the rooms, and the bill of materials. The techniques that are involved, how to elicit requirements, how to look for alternative scenarios, how to look for exceptions, how to know what questions to ask, how to make sure that the customers don't go into design before they mention all of their functional requirements. There is a big gap there. And it becomes especially prominent on large multidisciplinary enterprise projects.
So what then is your perspective on project scope management in these multidisciplinary and enterprise projects?
My recent experiences tell me that this is the place where things get really, really complicated. I will give you one example of a real project I was involved on. It was a telecom company in Europe, and the local Ministry of Communications just put ahead a legislation called mobile number portability. We in US and Canada went through that, if I'm not mistaken, between 7 and 10 years ago, which means that if I had my number with a mobile company A, I can freely move to mobile company B while keeping the same number. I'm sure you're familiar with this and your listeners are familiar with this notion. And initially, the perception at that particular company was that, well, it is really just an IT and possibly network engineering project. Why? Because, well, IT people will have to go in and change their scripts a little bit, that, this number does not longer belong to our company, so we have to treat it differently, etc., etc. Maybe we have to increase the network capacity. And while we were sitting in the room with representatives of each department of the company and we're starting to analyze this project, I asked them a question. I said, well, wait a second. We went through that in Canada and US about, again, I don't remember the exact date, but between 7 and 10 years ago. You have 4 companies in the market. Don't you expect the marketing wars to start right after the implementation of this legislation? And marketing people suddenly kind of popped up their heads and said, yeah, we do. Well, as a part of this project, do you think you need to have like a marketing plan that you will put ahead so that your customers are not lured away? They go, yeah. I go, what about sales, especially the corporate sales? And corporate sales people go, yeah, that's, we have to do something about it. And then I asked them, well, do you expect a large influx of calls to your customer relations centers from people who don't really understand this legislation and they have a lot of questions? Yes, we do. So should you increase the number of people at your customer relations centers? Yes, we do. Oh, by the way, should they be trained to answer those questions? And HR people go, yeah. And basically, we went through to make a long story short, we went through in each and every department of the company. And suddenly we realized that each department of that company had, sometimes small, sometimes large, part of the overall scope of the project to contribute to the bigger project. And very quickly, that project turned from 50 man-month in estimate to between 400 and 500 man-month. On such projects, the next question was, well, what methodology should we use to capture requirements? Yeah, IT is the driver, and we will go with functional and non-functional requirements. But what about marketing? What about training? How do we put it into one big requirements document, or do we create a whole bunch of separate requirements document. How do we reconcile them? Are there going to be any disconnects between them, potential ones? So, this becomes, hopefully I was able to make my point that on multidisciplinary or enterprise projects, that becomes a very, very, very difficult issue that needs to be dealt with.
Yeah, and because it is now so difficult and complex, project management plays into this, and we project managers have to step up and manage this, right?
Absolutely. You already mentioned that a little bit earlier in our conversation. If you don't know where you're going, it is very unlikely that you will end up in that particular point. The final output of project scope management is work breakdown structure. The key output. What is work breakdown structure? It's basically a listing of all the tasks that need to be completed in order to deliver the project. Well, guess what? When you go into project cost management, i.e. creation of the budget, you base your budget on the work breakdown structure. When you create your schedule, project time management, you base your schedule on the work breakdown structure. When you manage your quality, or you define what kind of quality you want to have on your project, you go back to the work breakdown structure, to the requirements document. What kind of people, what kind of resources need to be brought on is defined by what kind of product you're trying to build. Risks, same thing. I can go through all 10 knowledge areas of project management, and you will discover that, again, my personal opinion, they all have their roots in the project scope management. So that's absolutely essential.
You mentioned earlier on, we're really only able here in the interview to look at the tip of the iceberg that is project scope management. And you've given us your top 5 tips that you would recommend to folks. To close this interview out, what are the 2 to 3 scope management related activities and tips that you always like to do and make sure that they're done properly on your project so that project scope management gets the appropriate focus?
Well, probably it's a good question. Probably number one point that I would like to make at the very beginning of the project to all the stakeholders is that, guys, we're starting this project, and guess what? I'm going to be coming over to you and for starts, for one-on-one interviews. And please be prepared that I'm going to be asking a lot of questions. Sometimes this question might sound dumb, but trust me, by asking these seemingly dumb questions, sometimes you uncover a lot of potential risks and issues on the project. So you have to educate your stakeholders that you don't just walk in and say, I want a house, a family home, and you walk away and it is delivered to you. You have to invest time with me. Another point that I would like to make is that you have to know these techniques. You have to practice. You have to know the pros and cons of which technique. You have to know how to combine different methods to elicit the requirements. And number 3 things that I absolutely love to do, and I recommend to do it to all of your listeners, is once the requirement specification draft is written in whatever form you choose, and I do realize that they will differ from industry to industry, by all means, gather your customers again, walk them through that document, explain to them that while this exercise might sound exceedingly boring, there will be a lot of mistakes that will be caught while those mistakes are still on paper and not in stone, so to speak. Have technical inspections with your teams of the documentation. If possible, do peer reviews. That's the case where 2 project managers working on 2 different projects exchange the requirements documentation and read it purely from a professional standpoint, trying to find the bad words that should not appear there, ambiguities, inconsistencies, etc., etc. So these are the top 3 things that I do.
All right. Once again, the book is written by Jamal Mustafayev. It is titled Project Scope Management, a Practical Guide to Requirements for Engineering, Product Construction, IT and Enterprise Projects. It is published by CRC Press, and it's about 315 pages long. Jamal, thanks for being here today.
Thank you, Cornelius. Always happy to be a guest at your program.
And that was our interview with Jamal Mustafayev about project scope management. If you are a project manager who wants to become PMP certified, then the easiest way to do so is with our sister podcast, the Project Management Prepcast, and study for the exam by watching the in-depth exam prep video training from pmprepcast.com. And that's it. Thank you very much for listening. As always, you can find us on the web at pm-podcast.com. Please send your emails to info@pm-podcast.com. And when you write, please tell me where in the world you are writing from. And finally, we have this. The only way to make money as a project manager is to succeed on your projects in one place, get fired, and then get hired somewhere else. Until next time.